Hello! You're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and I'm doing a slightly different video today. There was a couple of dueling speeches in the last week between Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney. Now, Mark Carney wasn't intentionally having a dueling speech with Poilievre. Poilievre had a reply speech to him. But I'm going to do a slightly different video format. Let me know in the comments below if you like this difference in style. But the gist is, I'm going to play the speech, I'm going to pause it and comment what I want to comment. And I will be playing both this speech from Carney in full, and I'll be then playing the one from Poilievre in full, and then at the end of both speeches, I will just give my 2 cents. I think this video is probably going to be a bit longer than a normal video, but seems reasonable. And in the comment, or in the description below, I have the link to both speeches if you want to watch them without my commentary. But with no further ado, let us start.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along.
So, for the most part, I completely agree with what Carney's saying here. But there is two important criteria. He kind of dismissively says that Thucydides' comment there, he dismissively references it, implying that this kind of realism logic to geopolitics is incorrect or not accurately describing things, or insufficient, perhaps, might be the word he would use. I don't think that's the best way to see this. This does routinely happen time and again. There can be idealistic leaders in countries, in great powers, who use their idealism to govern as anything other than a power-driven, security-driven entity, which is the base state of great power. That does happen, but what happens every time you see this in history is those great powers and those leaders who run these idealistic programs weaken their own country. Because at the end of the day, the core logic of geopolitical realism is correct in that this taking realist actions does strengthen your country. Now, I will caveat that strengthening the country might not be the best thing for the average person in said country, but it is the best thing from the point of view of the state being as strong as possible. And since Carney kind of dismisses this Thucydides here, kind of backhandedly, it does kind of miss some other nuances. The idea that this rules-based international order is dead is silly. It never existed. The thing that people refer to when they say the rules-based international order, ideally, they might be saying it's the UN. But the UN has been gripped by great power conflict its entire existence, except that brief moment when the Soviet Union was boycotting it in the late 1940s, which is how the UN-backed intervention into South Korea, or into Korea, happened. But other than the UN, the other thing people refer to is all of these big NGOs, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, all these other things. But in the end, these things are funded and these things exist ultimately in service to U.S. imperial power. Now, you might think that's good or bad. That's neither here nor there. These aren't This rules-based international order was nothing more than the U.S. being one of two great powers for the last 80 years, and between 1990 and about 2015 was the only consequential great power. Russia had some strength, but it was pretty weak, and China hadn't quite developed yet. So the rules-based international order was just the U.S. as a great power with no meaningful rivals. The U.S. hegemony.
To accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't.
Carney's also not wrong on this point. In the face of great powers using their power to further themselves, as a secondary power, or a tertiary power, or God forbid you're like a quaternary power or something like that, you're really only left with two options. Either be so irrelevant that they don't care about you, or persuade them to not screw with you too much. For example, Finland, after World War II, had a policy of official neutrality, so the Soviet Union would leave them alone for the most part. Or you have, say, Canada's policy over the last 70 years, which was slow but consistent integration into the U.S. to keep the U.S. happy with Canada, because that's what the U.S. wanted. Those are really the only two ways you can engage with something, with a great power. They want control over you, either directly or indirectly. It is refreshing, in my opinion, to see a politician so cogently speaking about these things, because many of them, especially in the West, are either naive idealists or just lying about the nature of geopolitics. But Carney, in this speech, is being fairly down to earth about what this actually means.
So what are our options? In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with a greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down.
So, again, Carney, I think, is directionally correct on this. So it is a bit ironic for him to be saying such things, but I will not go off tangent here on stuff like that. But it is a bit ironic in my mind. But the issue with a call like this is he is essentially trying to imply that the emperor has no clothes or something like that. Like the international order is anything but what it actually has been. Now, you could say, oh, people were idealistically pretending it wasn't that, and perhaps that's what he's trying to get at. Though, I don't think, if that was his intention, I think his wording should have been better. It's a bit ambiguous. It could be read that way, or it could be read the way I just described it. But even if we give him the benefit of the doubt, and he is describing it as the current order is a lie, basically, we're all pretending to agree to the lie. The problem with that is there is actually an incentive structure to agree, not with the lie, but with what's happening anyways. You don't need to be pretending that everything is this rules-based international order that's all above board and there's no everyone's being equal and there's no bullying going involved. You don't have to believe that or even pretend to believe that for countries and companies to benefit from complying with the US-based system. One of the reasons what makes the US-based imperial project perhaps more genius than ones in the past is it's pretty invisible, but because of the way it's set up, it is incentivized for people to engage into it. You can be fully coherent and fully cognizant of what's going on and not sugarcoat it, and it still will make a lot of sense for a lot of different organizations to buy into it. And that's kind of the overall flaw with this speech, which we'll get onto going forward, but that's just something I want you to keep in mind going forward, is that he's calling for people to do something that doesn't really work. There's no tangible action to be done, but I'll push on that more later into the speech.
4 decades. For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works.
Again, just to keep pushing my last point here, the core flaw with the argument here is, like, yes, Canada has had idealist leaders in the past, such as Justin Trudeau. And those idealist leaders in many ways did do what he said and just put the sign in the window and ignored reality to signal to the thing. But in a lot of regards, for a lot of countries involved, even on realist terms, engagement with the US and the contractual setup that has occurred did make sense. Now, in some cases, it doesn't make sense. In that regard, Carney is correct. I would say for Canada, a lot of the deep integration with the US has been a cataclysmic level of mistake for the Canadian sovereignty. If you've ever followed my Twitter before, you'll know I have talked in great depth before about how NAFTA was a mistake, for example. Those kind of integrations were a mistake. And they didn't really give a lot of prosperity to Canada. In that regard, I think Carney is incorrect. A lot of the following of the rules-based system and the American hegemony is not necessarily conducive with prosperity to the countries involved. Because that's not the point. And that's really the key here. The point of these systems, the point of American hegemony, was not the collective security of everybody. It wasn't to create prosperity involved. Things like patrolling the sea lanes and such that he touches on were tools used by the Americans to enforce their hegemony. They're not done as gracious acts to the world. They're not done in a way that was selfless. They are done with the intention of furthering U.S. power. And they worked. They still work to do that. But that doesn't mean those actions aren't self-interested. And a lot of the countries involved were self-interestedly doing it. They're not, for the most part, there might have been, yes, idealists involved. There might have been people just going along to get along. But many people were doing this with eyes open, knowing what was happening, and agreed to the deals. Some of the deals might have been terrible, but they agreed to them because it was the best position they could take. Or they gambled, NAFTA in this regard being a major gamble by Mulroney. I think it was a disastrous gamble, but it was a major gamble on his part to try to take power from Central Canada to put it to Western Canada.
Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
He is completely correct here, except there isn't, for the most part, net benefit from a lot of these things. The integration wasn't a benefit per se. A lot of the benefits the world in the West has seen in the last 70 years are not primarily driven by US-led integration and globalization. In fact, a lot of the globalization elements were negatives. Most of the benefits came from automation, technological innovation, population growth itself being a benefit that has made the world a better place, because you need more people let you have more specialization. At the same time, we did a bunch of these integrations with American hegemony, so a lot of these things can be correlated together, but that's not strictly the cause here. And what you see now, and why you're seeing the U.S. throw tariffs, or China throw retaliatory tariffs, or mineral trades, or silicon chip trades and stuff being restricted, and Russia being kicked out of monetary, or like the SWIFT settlement system and stuff like that. Those things are happening because an integrated economy that occurred during the peak of American hegemony in the late 90s, early 2000s is a liability when geopolitics reasserts itself. And geopolitics necessarily has to reassert itself if the U.S. can no longer maintain its hegemonic position. And the hegemonic position is essentially the U.S. can beat the next two military powers, or at least let's phrase it as the two strongest revisionist powers of the global system. The U.S. could defeat them. Then it's a hegemon. But right now, it's unlikely that the U.S. could defeat Russia and China simultaneously. Maybe if it got a coalition of all of Europe, all of the supposed allies of the U.S. in the Pacific, if all those guys joined together, maybe they could do it. But then that's not the U.S. being hegemonic. That's the U.S. leading a coalition of nations. But if you go back to like 1995, the U.S. probably could defeat China and Russia in a war. Now, I don't think the U.S. could have conquered either country, but they could stop either country from invading a third country. Or in phrases, the U.S. probably could have defended Taiwan and Ukraine simultaneously in 1995. It cannot do that right now in 2026.
The multilateral institutions on which the middle powers have relied, the WTO, the UN, the COP, the architecture, the very architecture of collective problem solving are under threat. And as a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusions, that they...
Again, I just want to keep reiterating this point here. Those institutions are under threat not because they are useful institutions. It's because they are not useful institutions that they are under threat. The thing with international relations is there is no sovereign. There's nobody with a strong military coercive power and universal jurisdiction who can force all the countries to play along nicely. All you have is an anarchy of countries. Some are more powerful than others, but none are recognized and acknowledged as the sovereign of the world. Even at the peak of U.S. hegemony, countries like China, Russia, India refused to accept that the U.S. was in charge. They might have complied because they couldn't stop the U.S., but they would not recognize that they are subordinate to the U.S., that they are owned by the U.S. in that regard. But now, as great power competition reasserts itself, and Russia and China, and in the case of Iran or Israel or other such countries, are increasingly pushing against each other, fighting wars with each other, carrying out their own modern foreign policies, their own expansive agendas, it's not useful for the U.S. to maintain these international organizations like the World Trade Organization, or at least not use them in their own form. It's not useful for China to play along with the WTO. Maybe to the extent that it's humoring it, but not to fully comply, not to fully play ball. It doesn't really make sense. And there's no one who can truly enforce that. The only thing you can do if China has a bad trade policy with you is for you to have a trade war with them, or a real war. They could break all the rules of the WTO, and you can't do anything about it, because the WTO has no teeth. It's only useful when there is one country, the US, idealistically using its military power to enforce this powerless institution. But the US doesn't do that right now. It hasn't done that at least since Barack Obama's days, and the consequence of these kind of idealistic actions is they burn American money, they burn American lives, they disintegrate American social cohesion, because the propaganda apparatus of the state has to be used to get people ready and willing to fight these wars. And the wars, such as in Iraq in 2003 and Afghanistan in 2001, maybe originally started well-intentioned, but the fact that they were carried on for so long burns a lot of state power, burns a lot of money, burns a lot of lives. And that disintegrates cohesion of the United States, which is leading it to what we have with Trump now. Trump is not an anomaly. He is the symptom of a great power that has burned itself for idealistic reasons.
They must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance and supply chains. And this impulse is understandable. A country that can't feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. But let's be clear-eyed about where this leads. A world of fortresses will be poorer, more fragile, and less sustainable.
He's probably correct on that. But there is no alternative. He's going to try to present an alternative here, but there is actually no alternative. We are probably going to be, in generally speaking, poorer if we are investing resources into power conflict instead of just economic growth. The peace dividend is actually something that existed and was economically good. And that's going to be gone when people have to spend 5% on defense spending. But there is no alternative. It's like saying, hey, it would be great. Think of how much money we could save if no one in society had to ever lock anything because no one would steal anymore. If everyone just stopped having theft. Imagine prices in all the grocery stores would probably fall like 5% if theft was gone. No more theft had ever occurred. And all that shrinkage that they have to raise prices to pay for was zero. That'd be great. But you'd be living in a fantasy to think that. In the long run, maybe you could introduce some policies like Costco does, which reduces how much shrink Costco has, or what Loblaws has done in the last couple of years, which reduces their shrinkage. But where there's benefits in reduced shrinkage, there are other costs. There's more staff. The stores are slightly less or slightly more annoying to navigate because it's harder to leave the store. Is it worth it? Perhaps. But it's not a free lunch. There is no alternative situation to trying to keep your country as self-reliant as reasonable. Now, you can't be autarkic. That obviously doesn't work. We've seen that many times in the past. It doesn't work. But there's many stages between autarky and anti-autarky. And there is a middle ground there where you have at least sufficient domestic defense, sufficient domestic food, sufficient domestic industries that you can resist pressure. Because in the case of Canada, if we had a large military and the reasonable ability to build at least a reasonable amount of our equipment ourselves, we don't need to be able to build all military equipment ourselves, but at least enough of it. That gives us a lot of ability to resist pressure from, say, the US. Because, first off, power respects power. But second, you look at Trump's threats versus Canada with like 51st state kind of stuff, aggressive leaders like Trump would be less willing to make those threats if they thought the country they were threatening actually could resist or cause enough damage that it wasn't worth doing. One of the reasons in World War II why Switzerland wasn't invaded was the German High Command, despite Hitler asking for plans to be drawn up, thought it was not worth it to invade Switzerland. They were too well defended, too dug in, too stubborn, that yes, they probably could have defeated Switzerland, but it wasn't going to be worth the cost to defeat Switzerland. And that's the reality we're going into. We're going to be looking at countries needing to build a sufficiently large and a sufficiently autonomous defense apparatus that calculus plays out. But that always is what it had to be. Because anything else was just naked idealism masquerading as a foreign/defense policy.
And there's another truth. If great powers abandon even the pretense of rules and values for the unhindered pursuit of their power and interests, the gains from transactionalism will become harder to replicate. Hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships. Allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. They'll buy insurance, increase options in order to rebuild sovereignty. Sovereignty that was once grounded in rules but will increasingly be anchored in the ability to withstand pressure. This room knows.
Again, Carney is correct here. This is a correct thing to mention. When you have a power relationship, it is patron-client. The core of this relationship is that the patron gives to the client something. And in return, the client gives to the patron loyalty and maybe something back. So, for example, in a less abstract way, the way NATO worked, because the NATO is effectively the extension of the US empire in a more concrete form. The way it worked is the US would give to its clients military protection. And in return for that military protection, those clients would do and pass laws that the US wanted, either directly or indirectly, would provide bases for US military forces, would at least work together to contain US rivals, such as the Soviet Union. That was that core relationship. What we're seeing right now, and what's happening with Trump, is Trump no longer thinks the clients are doing their job. The clients right now no longer think the US is being a fair patron. And that's where this Trump versus the rest of NATO but clashing occurs. Both sides think the patron-client relationship is broken. The clients think the patron is being too onerous, and the patron thinks the clients are not being loyal. Who is correct? It depends only on your perspective. There's no objective way to evaluate that. It depends solely on your point of view. And I will not tell you which one to believe. But that is the argument.
This is classic risk management. Risk management comes at a price. But that cost of strategic autonomy, of sovereignty, can also be shared. Collective investments in resilience are cheaper than everyone building their own fortresses. Shared standards.
Again, he's correct, but he's wrong. This is a lot of this speech is he is correct, but he is wrong. It is cheaper to share, but that only goes so far. You can say, oh, well, wouldn't it be cheaper for everyone in NATO to get together and have one joint fighter program? It would be cheaper. They might even get a better quality product than every country going out their own. But you sacrifice something for that. You sacrifice autonomy. You sacrifice national security, because now you are tied to everyone else in this program. It's not your own autonomous program. So it's cheaper. It might even get better quality products. Not always, perhaps, but it might. But there are big hidden costs to this. It is sacrificing sovereignty. It is sacrificing autonomy. You can't sit here and say, aha, the US is an onerous patron, they're the worst, and then buy F-35s. But at the same time, you can't say, well, it'd be cheaper if we collectivize our defense and then complain about the consequences of collectivizing your defense. That's just the reality of it.
Standards reduce fragmentations. Complementarities are positive sum. And the question for middle powers like Canada is not whether to adapt to the new reality. We must. The question is whether we adapt by simply building higher walls or whether we can do something more ambitious. Now, Canada was amongst the first to hear the wake-up call, leading us to fundamentally shift our strategic posture. Canadians know that our old, comfortable assumptions that our geography and alliance memberships automatically conferred prosperity and security, that assumption is no longer valid.
One thing I want to add to this point, I think a lot of people naively get this, especially versus the tensions with the US. In the long-standing position of Canada over the last 60 so years, the idea that being an ocean away from Europe or Asia gave us a lot of insulation from the possible conflicts of the World War III. But it goes both ways. Being an ocean away reduces and insulates those countries from things that happen in North America. And that isn't an issue while the US is content with what Canada is doing. But if you have the US trying to renegotiate or bully Canada into a different geopolitical position, that ocean away changes things. One of the core flaws of Carney's speech here is his idea that Canada can join together with a coalition of middle powers to resist the influence of China or the US or Russia, or maybe in the future India, or maybe in the future some other country, Brazil perhaps. The problem with that is Canada is isolated from those countries. You can't get a coalition of European countries together and say, haha, Canada is added to the EU or something like that. It doesn't matter. We could be in the EU. We could be in a deep bilateral or multilateral military alliance with hard defense rules with the rest of Europe, with Japan, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Mexico. Mexico, actually, that's a bad example. Mexico could matter in this card. But all these other countries. But none of them border the US. None of them are nearby. So it's all great to say, hey, versus Russia, versus China, versus maybe Brazil or India or some other country. We're together. But are we? And are they with us if the US threatens Canada? And there's really no way to know this until it happens. But there's many reasons to believe it won't happen. By all means. I'm not saying we shouldn't sign treaties or have alliances. But what I am saying is it's not a security policy to put your faith in a coalition of middle powers to resist great powers when you're an ocean away from them. That policy might work if you're Germany, if you're Italy, if you're Poland, if you're Sweden. Because all around you are dozens and dozens of other middle powers. But it doesn't work when you're an ocean away from them. It doesn't work when their main threat, the main threat of Poland, is Russia. It's not the US. The main threat of Canada is arguably all three of these countries. The Russia, Chinese, and the US. But China is basically irrelevant to Poland. The US is helping Poland. So Poland is not a perfect ally with Canada. They're not aligned. And this logic will follow the more you do this. No two people are fully aligned on any issue. No two countries can ever be fully aligned on an issue. The reason why NATO worked for so long is it was created to oppose the Soviet Union and then the following Russian Federation. It hasn't worked to oppose China. The US has basically had to build a completely different organization to oppose China properly, and even then, it doesn't really work very well. And even inside that, Canada's never really pulled its own weight, at least in my lifetime in NATO. If you are Poland, and Canada's never hit the 2% defense target, and is nowhere close to the 5%, and has only increased notionally defense spending by reclassifying things like Coast Guard spending and other such, like Veterans Affairs spending, as defense spending. That doesn't lead you a lot of confidence. And if you're Poland, or if you're Estonia, if you're Latvia, if you're Lithuania, if you're Romania, if you're Hungary, if you're Finland, You're Sweden. Do you really want to deploy troops to North America? Ever? Russia's right there. What are the odds that the US is going to sail across the ocean and do anything other than be annoying with trade? Russia's right there, and they just invaded Ukraine. That's the core flaw of Carney's speech here.
And our new approach rests on what Alexander Stubb, the President of Finland, has termed value-based realism. Or to put another way, we aim to be both principled and pragmatic. Principled in our commitment to fundamental values, sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter, and respect for human rights. And pragmatic in recognizing that progress is often incremental, that interests diverge, that not every partner will share all of our values. So we're engaging broadly, strategically, with open eyes. We actively take on the world as it is, not wait around for a world we wish to be. We are calibrating our relationships so their depth reflects our values.
I'm going to cut the rest of the speech here. Again, you can follow the rest of it in the comment below. I stopped, again, around the 9-minute mark here. Because the rest of the speech, he goes off from, I think it's the meat and potatoes, and he starts talking about like the specifics of things he's done as Prime Minister to further this vision. And I don't really care to comment about that stuff because like he signed some treaties, he's done some stuff, like whatever. You can watch it. It's not really worth dissection, in my opinion. Because it's just carrying on the same things I've already touched on, but he's just rehashing it. I think the speech is honestly a little too long. I think if he cut it without the second half or so where he's talking about how Canada is doing all these things, it would have been a better speech. I think it went too long. But we're going to switch over here. I know this video is going to be longer than normal, but hey, I think these two speeches should be heard one versus the other. Because it's speech response kind of thing. So we're going to pop over to the other tab here. That's the wrong one. There we go. I'm probably not going to play this whole speech either. Again, you can see the whole thing without my commentary in the description. But here we go.
Minister Carney's well-crafted and eloquently delivered speech at Davos has been widely noted, and I want to start by offering my own praise. The Prime Minister is right to restate what many have said for years. Canada must become more self-reliant, less dependent, and work with like-minded countries to advance our interests. And Conservatives are, as always, willing to work with him to turn these words into results. What stood out most to me was when he pointed out, quote, the gaps between rhetoric and reality. That's especially true here at home. If liberal words and good intentions were tradable commodities, Canada would already be the richest nation on earth. Unfortunately, after a decade of promises and grand speeches, Liberals have made our economy costly and dependent, more so than ever. After nearly a year as Prime Minister, Mark Carney has made things only worse. The deficit has doubled, food inflation is double that in the States, housing costs have also doubled, the worst in the G7, and no pipelines are approved, anti-development laws removed. The military has a massive recruiting and equipment shortfall. There's still no free trade between provinces, no crime laws have been passed, and the Prime Minister's signature promise of negotiating a win with the U.S. is unfulfilled. Indeed, U.S. tariffs have more than doubled on Canada, while Mr. Carney's promised counter tariffs have vanished along with his elbows.
So, again, Poilievre does open up here. I think he's generally correct in that. I know some of you might be thinking to yourselves, hey, wait, you didn't play the stuff where Carney was talking about his domestic stuff. And it's like, yes, I didn't play that because I have nothing really to say about that in and of itself. So it would be dishonest for me to just play a speech from another YouTube channel that I didn't record myself, and I have nothing to say about it. To be dishonest, I don't want to put it. I'm only going to put things that I'm going to be replying to, because I want to be honest here. I don't want to basically content steal. But with that pin there. So I think Poilievre does correctly open up here. So Carney's big weakness with his big speech is he's mostly directionally correct. There's some things that I'm, as you saw in the first half or so of this video, I was critiquing how Carney was phrasing it, what he was saying, or like the intentions and stuff. But at the end of the day, if Carney believes that we're in a situation where the U.S. is not a trustworthy power, that we need to start building out things, this first 10 months of his premiership have been a disaster. He hasn't accomplished anything consequential. The only win you can really put on the book for him is the trade deal with China, and that comes with a lot of risks. And in fact, after initially appearing content with it, Trump is now using that as leverage to threaten us more. Is that Carney's fault? I'm not going to blame him for it, but it is just the fact of the reality. The core, more important things, defense, trade diversification, haven't happened. Again, all this China deal did is restore a previous trade arrangement. It didn't create new ones. It didn't help us diversify our markets. It restored a market that we were already trading with. That's the only thing that happened there. There hasn't been a new market. There hasn't been new ports being built, as far as I'm aware, in all of Canada. There's no pipelines started. There's no major infrastructure projects to have more export capacity. There's no defense spending happening. In fact, there's been a lot of waffling on if we're going to continue with some of our defense spending with the F-35 program. Now, if you are very much anti-US and you think that the US is our number one threat, by all means cancel the F-35 program. Replacing it with Saab and the Gripen doesn't make any sense, though, because the Gripen still uses about 40% US-made parts, most of which concentrated with the engine. Fun fact, airplanes don't work without engines. So it's not even a valid counterproposal, let alone the fact that it's basically an obsolete airframe these days, but that's another here or there.
Those unkept promises, which followed grand speeches and announcements, make us especially vulnerable to the world's dangers. We've had enough words. Now we need results. Now we need to unblock our resources. Now we must approve pipelines. Now we must bolster our military to protect our soil, sea, and skies. Now we need to crack down on foreign interference, threats, and intimidation of our people from hostile powers like China, Russia, and Iran. The last 5 years have shown us that we can't count on others. Our closest neighbor and largest trading partner, the United States, struck us with tariffs and questioned our sovereignty. Now that is short-sighted, and I believe it will hurt them too. But we can't control what they do, and no one can control what President Trump does or says.
So Poilievre is mostly correct here, but I do have a big quibble. So I pause on a kind of funny face for him. My quibble is, you can actually kind of control what Trump does or says. Trump's pretty predictable, in my 2 cents. And the reason he's acting this way towards Canada is he thinks we're a bad client state. And he thinks we're too soft on China. Now, again, whether that is reasonable or not, different question altogether. But to say it's unpredictable, it's pretty predictable. We could have, in hindsight, we probably could have foreseen this. A lot of people put their eye, myself included, missed it, mostly because we didn't want it to happen. But it was, in hindsight, predictable. I also think it's a bit naive to think the US is going to be substantially, at this stage, disadvantaged by these tariffs and these arrangements that have occurred. They haven't been yet. A lot of the times, a lot of mainstream economics overstates their position. One issue, this is not me to say, I'm not an economist, I'll clear that up. I'm not going to say here that all economists in the world are wrong. But a lot of this is vastly overstated because we don't have we can't test this stuff properly. If you're talking about what is the proper tariff rate for the US, no one knows. It's impossible to know. We can say maybe it should be higher, maybe it should be lower, but you don't know what the correct rate is because there's no way to do this experiment. The only way to check this is to raise the tariffs as the US and see what happens. Now, I don't want to go too far into this point because I do have stronger opinions on some of the stuff, but it will derail the video. But the core point here is a lot of times when people talk about economics, they take a much too dogmatic view of issues. There are correct answers and there are wrong answers in economics. But it's one of those fields that requires a lot of humility because there's a lot of things that we just can't know. Because unlike physics, unlike chemistry, you can't do a lab experiment. Even if you make a complicated simulation model, that's not reality. That's a simulation. It's not one-to-one. There are going to be variables you missed. Or in the words of one economist on YouTube, I can't think of the guy's name, if you make the model too realistic, too granular, too specific, then you kind of don't really understand what's happening anymore. It's just too complicated. People can't really understand it. And that's kind of the gist with economics. A modern economy is really complicated. I think it's naive to say in the face of 3/4 of really strong growth in the US that their tariffs are hurting them. The contrapositive would imply that they would be doing even better or as good, which maybe they would be doing as good, that's possible, but doing even better seems astounding because they weren't doing better. They weren't doing better in Q1 2025 or at all in 2024. But I digress.
I know it's tempting to say our relationship with America is over forever. But here's the reality. We still live next door to the biggest economy and military the world has ever seen. We sell 20 times more to the U.S. than we do to China. 1 in 10 Canadian jobs rely directly or indirectly on trade with America. We owe it to those workers, our friends, family, and fellow Canadians to ensure those jobs don't go away.
Poilievre hits on that point here, which I was saying earlier in my segment about Carney, which is even if your eyes open about the world order, your eyes open about all these things, you're cognizant, you're not putting signs in your window to signal to this idealistic idea that doesn't exist, there are still compelling reasons to engage with it anyways. In the case of Canada, as Poilievre hits on the nail on the head here, we trade vastly with the U.S. So much money passes between our borders, even with the current tariffs on Canada. A lot of it is because the tariffs are only on things that are not USMCA compliant, but I digress again. So there is a compelling reason to play ball with the U.S., even if all these other things are happening. Even if the U.S. is saying and doing all these things. Because our economy, in many regards, is dependent now. It wasn't always the case, but it is the case right now.
Growing and diversifying our economy is essential, as all political parties have been saying for decades. But we must also remember that our trade and security partnership with the U.S. is centuries old and will outlast one president.
So Poilievre was just wrong here. The security partnership with the U.S. is not centuries old. It's at most like 80 years old. Well, certainly not centuries. Even calling it a century and pushing back to like a little more than a century and pushing it back to 1917, I think is really overstating it, because there was a British Empire, which Canada was a part of, formally and informally until after World War II, and informally until 1931. There was a US-UK naval arms race after World War I, and this led to the Washington Naval Treaty. But it's possible, without that treaty, that the tensions could have kept ramping up. The US made military plans to invade Canada in the 1920s and the 1930s. Prior to that, the US had plans to invade Canada in 1866. They did invade Canada in 1812. The partnership we've had with the US is really a post-World War II affair. And in many regards, it's post-1956, when Pearson betrayed the UK, well, the Liberal government, but particularly Pearson as Foreign Minister, betrayed the Liberal government in the Suez Crisis and sided with the US. That's probably when you could say it started. Maybe a little before that, maybe like 1950. But again, you're not really getting much more than 80 years. Even if you want to push to World War II in 1941. That's not 80 years. It's barely 80 years.
To quote the British Liberal Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, "We have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. We should continue to work with allies."
Palmerston, Lord Palmerston there, and Poilievre, in referencing him, are correct in that the correct thing to do as a country is to not be personal about what other countries are doing. Everyone is acting in their own interest. It might hurt you. It might be against you, and that's fine. You don't have to be friends with them in this current moment. But there is no infinite indemnity. That's one of the reasons why the relationship between Canada and the US changed. It wasn't that the US conquered Canada. That didn't happen. It wasn't that we conquered the US. Obviously, that didn't happen. It changed because our government decided it should change, and the US government decided it should change. Our interests were aligned. That's all this thing is. That's how you should be viewing geopolitics. When you put the idealistic lenses behind it, yes, you can feel warm and fuzzies in yourself because you're being idealistic. But you cause more harm to yourself and to the world in the long run acting that way. The US would be in a better position if it did not act idealistically during the hegemonic period. If it acted as a self-interested hegemon, the world would be in a less divisive place than it is right now.
Allies within the U.S. that are outside the administration to minimize the damage until a larger relationship repair can be completed. And I restate once again my offer to the Prime Minister that Conservatives stand ready to help his government fight U.S. tariffs. But while we hope for the best, it would be naive to assume that things will go back to exactly what they were. Whether the next administration is Republican or Democrat, tariffs may be here for the foreseeable future. None of that, though, is an
Poilievre is correct here, and I think this, again, not necessarily Carney's mistake, but this is a mistake I see a lot of people in Canada make right now, is this naive idea that, oh, everything's going to be fine when the Democrats win in 2028. So, pinning first that they might not win in 2028. But even if they did, we saw the Democrats when they won in 2020. Biden carried out all of Trump's policy for the most part. There's some trade policy, that is, and foreign policy, that is. There were some changes, but not consequential. He replaced some of the tariffs on like steel and cars and stuff like that with essentially the same idea, but invisible, with massive industrial subsidies. That's basically the same idea as to what Trump is doing, but it's more hidden than what Trump is doing. And there really is no substantial reason to think it's going to change if the Democrats win again. Maybe it will, but we shouldn't count on it. And if the Republicans win again, it's going to continue. It's certainly going to continue, absent any deals that Trump has signed or a future Republican might sign as a drawdown. A mutual agreement kind of thing where they get something and we get something. But that's kind of what's going on. A lot of this stuff is people think that this will not stay forever, but it probably will. The U.S. is getting like in the realm of $300 billion a year in tariff revenue. I would be impressed to ever see a government willing to just forego such a consequential amount of revenue forever. Their revenue increased. Like, that's a really important thing here. A lot of times when you raise taxes or cut taxes, the long-run revenue curve has not changed. There might be a temporary boost or temporary reduction, but people recalibrate and things stay the same. Maybe next year you'll see income tax receipts or sales tax receipts go down in the U.S., but right now it doesn't look like it's doing that. It seems to be just increased fiscal capacity for the U.S. government. And if that's the case, if by 2028 or 2029, when a Democrat takes office, or if a Democrat takes office, and the U.S. fiscal capacity is just higher because of tariffs than it would be otherwise, they're not going to get rid of them. It'd be almost insane not to. Even when left wingers, when right wingers or conservatives want to cut income taxes or cut sales taxes, the idea is that this doesn't actually affect the fiscal capacity of the government, because the net benefit of the taxes being cut will increase economic activity and revenue collection and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I digress again.
Excuse for letting our guard down and repeating past mistakes by making Canada even more vulnerable to aggressive powers like the People's Republic of China, which the Prime Minister himself called our greatest threat only a few months ago. It was with great irony that the Prime Minister quoted one of the greatest heroes of the 20th century fight against totalitarian communism, Václav Havel, less than a week after launching a, quote, strategic partnership for a new world order with the Chinese communist regime, a partnership that includes plans to deepen engagement on national security issues at a senior level. We cannot throw caution to the wind with a regime that kidnaps our citizens, steals our technology, interferes in our elections, sets up illegal police stations on our soil, and has a history of using trade as a tool for diplomatic warfare against us.
So Poilievre is correct in that China is not a nice country. It's not a better partner than the U.S., probably a worse partner than the U.S. But even if everything Poilievre touches on there was fixed, if there was no downside in straight terms with working in China, they respected our internal affairs, they didn't do any spying, they didn't bully us, they didn't kidnap anybody. If none of those things happened, it would still be very reckless to engage with China. Now, I don't think, in the grand scheme of things, Carney's deal is that reckless. It might be vis-a-vis Trump, but that's a separate question than the actual recklessness of the deal itself. But it depends on how much the security arrangement matters, to be fair. But the core issue here, and this is a lot of things I see people making right now, is you can't have, as Canada, a close partnership with another great power. Carney's middle power ideas might work, maybe, but it can't be another great power, especially on national security issues, because that is a threat to the U.S. Now, should the U.S. have the right to invade Canada because we're doing something like that? Of course not, but that doesn't matter. They will do it if they want to do it. If they think that we are a risk, they will invade us. To think anything else is naivety. And in a much less egregious, much less risky move, Ukraine effectively did this in 2014. It tried to pull closer to the US, to NATO, to Europe. And look where it brought it. Was it right for Russia to invade Ukraine? No, of course not. Was it predictable that Russia was going to invade, or at least seize territory from Ukraine? Well, it already happened immediately after Ukraine did this, so yeah, it was perfectly predictable. But of course it was going to get worse. That's what the whole little cold civil war the civil war in the Donbass was. Whether it was real or not, I don't care. Doesn't matter. And Ukraine, unlike Canada, has a direct land border with Europe, with NATO. And Russia's much weaker than the US and NATO is. Not as much as many people pretend it is, but it is weaker. It is weaker. And in that case, if Russia's still able to take territory from Ukraine in a war with NATO backing Ukraine, and Ukraine has all sorts of advantages that Canada doesn't, it's reckless to engage significantly with national security concerns with a foreign power, with a foreign great power. It's a very dangerous proposal. Should it be that way? No. But, again, it doesn't matter. The ought versus is framing is very, very important. Should it ought be that way? No. But it is that way. It is that way. To describe the world is not to agree with it prescriptively. No one is saying the US should have a veto on Canadian foreign policy or trade policy. But our trade policy and our foreign policy, up until the point that our military strength is enough that the US has reason to want caution with the Canada. Until that stage, they do kind of have an informal veto. And the only way to change that is to build a very strong military in Canada. A large navy, a large air force, a large army. Navy being very important, and Air Force being very important, because if we can't control the seaways, at least even partially, then they can just blockade us to submission either way.
If this is what the Prime Minister meant when he told the Davos crowd that he is calibrating our relationships so their depth reflects our values, then I seriously question his values and, frankly, his judgment. Of course, we have to trade with China, as we always have, but without losing our compass or our national security.
This is actually a funny point where Carney's rhetoric, again, probably correctly criticized, it doesn't really line up with what he did, but Poilievre is almost criticizing it from the wrong angle. The issue isn't that Carney's not being idealistic enough. That's good, actually. The idealism is bad in foreign politics. You want to divorce idealism from your vocabulary, from your mind, when you engage with foreign geopolitics. It doesn't matter. You can't survive as a country and prosper if you are going to compromise your security for idealism. So in that regard, Poilievre is correct, perhaps, to criticize Carney from a linguistic level, but his criticism is wrong. The problem isn't that Carney's not being idealistic in making a deal with China. It's that he's not being pragmatic in making a deal with China. That's the problem. Who cares about the idealism of engaging with China? It's not pragmatic to make a big national security agreement with China.
At the same time, we must continue the work of Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister who expanded our network of trade with more like-minded middle power countries. It's not a new idea. In fact, we already have free trade with most of the middle powers that the Prime Minister recognized in his Davos speech after the previous Conservative government negotiated agreements with a record 46 countries. Given that we already have these agreements in place, what stops us from growing trade with those countries is not their trade barriers on us, but our trade barriers on ourselves. Liberal laws like C-69 and C-48 make it impossible to approve projects or ship energy to other countries on different coasts. It takes 19 years to approve a mine in Canada. The Liberal government has created these laws and obstacles.
Just one sub-tangential note on the mine question. I don't know the exact number. Maybe Poilievre is correct in saying 19 years. Doesn't matter. There is actually quite an interesting point I've seen a lot recently where specifically copper, but also other precious metals, and precious metals and other important industrial metals like those, there's going to be a massive shortage if we're going to try to electrify the world. Like, if our idea is to have all electric cars, all like electric heating and stuff like heat pumps and all that stuff for everybody, and we're minimize the number of ICEs. If that is actually the plan people are trying to actually do, we need to mine an astronomical amount of more copper in the world. So there is actually a very big market to refine and make better our mining regulations so we can do more mining in Canada. We actually have a lot of natural resources we could sell. That way, now, I think we should be very careful with that because we want to just turn ourselves into a natural resource exporting country. We want to try to build some industries along with that, but there is a big market there.
And almost a year after taking office, Mr. Carney has not removed a single law or bureaucracy, or approved a single pipeline, or removed the industrial carbon tax, which drives food and housing costs up and industry out.
Other thing I want to just note here, I don't think Poilievre is wrong in critiquing the industrial carbon tax here, but I'm so tired of it. Buddy, can you just talk about literally anything else? Sure, when you get if you win an election, get rid of the industrial carbon tax. Sure, do it. But seriously, talk about literally anything else.
Hundreds of billions of private dollars looking to invest in wildly profitable projects like a pipeline to the Pacific. Money to get Canada's energy flowing and Canada's workers working. We have the resources under our feet. The only thing missing is permits. The federal permits from the Carney government, which are still among the slowest in the world. Grand announcements, new government agencies, signing ceremonies, red carpets, and stacking new laws and bureaucracies on top of old ones will do nothing. There's no magic to this. What we need is for the Carney government to get out of the way and approve these privately funded projects. Mr. Carney told the crowd in Davos that, quote, a country that cannot feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. So why can't we? Just this week, Canada was declared the food inflation capital of the G7. And last year, Canadians who can't feed themselves made a record 2 million visits to a food bank every single month, more than double than the number from 7 years ago. In a country with almost endless farming potential.
One of the interesting things about that note is we have lots of arable land in Canada. We currently cultivate lots of arable land. This is really tangential, but it's something I know and I wanted to share to the world. But you might be interested to hear this. We cultivate less acres of land in Canada today than we did 100 years ago. When we were prior to World War I, when Canada's population, I believe, was 7 million people, we cultivated more acreage of land in Canada than we did today. Like, my home province of Nova Scotia has had, I think, a 50% decrease in the acreage farmed. Now, what's happened is a lot of very marginal farmlands been stopped being cultivated because food production increased and international trade allows more diversification of food purchasing. So, for example, in the past, we might grow twice as many apples in Nova Scotia, but some of those apples would be dried or turned into jams or whatever for the winter. But now we just buy apples from like Chile or like Argentina. So we don't actually need the apple production to have apples for the winter time. We only need the apples for the time when the apples would be fresh, because we can just buy them from South Africa or Chile or Thailand or whatever. And that is one interesting, just a little tangent I had there.
We have the potential to be the most affordable and the richest country in the world because we have the most land, resources, and coastline. We need to unblock.
Okay, I'm going to pin the rest of this speech here because he's just going to really go into more of a campaign pitch kind of thing, which is why I pinned Carney's one, because we stopped talking about more interesting things about like the core content of the speech, and we start talking more about this is what I'm going to do, or, oh, look at the things we're doing, like, whatever. I recommend you watch both of these speeches in full. I stopped here at 7:42, so there's about 5 minutes left. But I've pinned both of them for interest of fairness and time, because there's really nothing I obviously, especially if you watch on Twitter, I have political opinions. I try to be an unbiased source, or person, but I mean, like, it is what it is. I do prefer being correct on my modeling than I prefer to be partisan, so you can always trust me there. I would rather be right than be partisan in that regard. But when we're talking about, like, campaign messaging in this regards, there's nothing really to say about the second half of Carney's or Poilievre's speech here. Like, it's politicking. And I don't have any strong opinions about their politicking that's worth mentioning here on the channel. With that, I'll wrap this guy up, and I will be trying to get poll releases this week, but I will let you guys know on timetables for that. But with that, I bid you guys adieu, and I will see you next week with something else.